architect in New York to redesign that beautiful facade. Inside was a beauty salon, a music room. There were music rooms in all of their homes because even when they were poor in St. Louis, again, Sarah had been in the choir. The Brothers Barbershop was a place where musicians hung out for a while. They lived across the alley from Tom Turpin's Rosebud Cafe, where he played his early ragtime compositions. So they loved music even when they didn't have a lot of means. Madam Walker, of course, was a great philanthropist, and A'Lelia Walker, as the daughter of a larger-than-life figure, was struggling to find her own way to have an imprint, and she tapped into their love of music. During World War I, her philanthropy came this. She joined the Red Cross, and while other people were knitting socks and sending cigarettes, she had this big idea to buy an ambulance, to raise money for an ambulance. She invited her friend Enrico Caruso, the operatic tenor, to be the cameo, and they raised the money to buy the ambulance. And then Enrico Caruso visited Villa Lawaro, Madam Walker's home. A'Lelia had persuaded her mother to move to New York as her health was failing, so the company stayed in Indianapolis. Madam Walker moved her residence to New York, and she said to her lawyer that that beautiful townhouse was not big enough for two women. So she had to hire Vertner Tandy to construct this house for her, which is still standing and is a National Historic Landmark. Again, there is a music room because they wanted their friends to be able to entertain. Madam Walker died in 1919. She'd only lived in the house for a year, and her daughter became president of the Madam C.J. Walker Manufacturing Company. This is the executive team. In 1921, A'Lelia Walker sailed to Paris. Then she went to Cairo. She went to Monte Carlo, Palestine, Addis Ababa, where she met the Empress, and really had a sort of an eat, pray, love kind of trip as she was getting over a bad marriage. She continued her work in the leadership role at the Walker Company. This is the 1924 convention of Walker sales agents. Madam Walker had had her first convention in 1917 with more than 200 women who would have been sharecroppers and laundresses and maids, washerwomen, and she was giving them a chance to be independent, economically independent, to create generational wealth. But you can see that this army of sales agents has really grown. A'Lelia Walker, again, find her way and her philanthropy, her mark. She really, as you can see, was quite flamboyant. As one society columnist said, she didn't just walk into a room, she swept into a room. That she would decide she was going to have a party, and she would get on the phone and she would say, "Darling, I'm having a party tonight, and it wouldn't be the same without you." Absolutely not. So she really did have this amazing ability to bring people together. As her friends, her younger friends, like Countee Cullen and Langston Hughes, were being published, and Zora Neale Hurston, and they were being celebrated. You know, there's the 1925 very famous Opportunity Dinner where they were given awards. She wanted to find a way to support them, and so she converted a floor of her townhouse into what became known as the Dark Tower. She had been entertaining there for a very long time, having poetry readings and receptions, but this was something very special. And in October 1927, she sent invitations saying, "We dedicate this tower to the aesthetes, that cultural group of young Negro writers, sculptors, painters, music artists, composers, and their friends, a quiet place of particular charm, a rendezvous where they may feel at home to partake of a little tidbit amid pleasant, interesting atmosphere." So she was creating something that didn't really exist in Harlem. There were her other friends had lovely homes on Strivers Row, but she was the one who had 3 homes and the money and the resources to really entertain. This is the menu from the Dark Tower, the original menu. My grandparents saved lots of things, which is why I can tell these stories. And one of my favorite things on the menu, which is on the left-hand side, you can't read it, but it's like 8 or 9 items up. It's A'Lelia Walker iced tea. And it was Prohibition. So we can only imagine what might have been in the iced tea, whether it was served or you brought your own. A'Lelia Walker was so flamboyant, so charismatic that lots of artists and sculptors wanted to portray her. And so these are just some examples. On the left is Bernice Abbott, the famous photographer. In the middle is a pastel by Richmond Barté, and on the right is a sculptor named Roy Shelton. And I just want to end on this before my friend Michelle comes out. I just love this picture because it shows A'Lelia Walker and her friends having a good time. You know, sometimes the story of A'Lelia Walker makes her into a dilettante, and that she, you know, was almost an airhead. I mean, kind of a caricature, especially the Netflix series, which is really, really wrong. But I want people to know that what she did was to bring people together in a way that others couldn't. So, Michelle, I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Me too. Thanks. Thanks. Well, thank you all. Thank you for writing this book. And thank you all for coming out. Because, but it could be me. Could be me. Okay. Wait. Your hair looks great, by the way. So,
Thank you.
I'm so glad you
We've
told
known each other since before I had gray hair.
Well, but I'm so glad you explained like what was in that hair care formula, because I have wanted to know for years like what made it so amazing.
It was so basic, you know, and it's, you know, you think it's at a time, penicillin is, you know, it's not even a thing yet.
But it just, people didn't wash their hair.
Right. Well, that was the deal, that they didn't
She
wash
got
their
people
hair.
to wash their hair. Let me just, first of all, I'm so glad you wrote this book.
Thank you.
Because maybe y'all feel the same way. It's almost like our stories are so often about suffering that we don't often take time to talk about triumph. And this is a triumph.
And we need that right now.
And also, I don't know if any of y'all are following the whole Meghan Markle controversy, but the whole issue with her is like, why does she get to have a soft life? Why does she get to have a soft life? Who is she? And I'm thinking that A'Lelia was like the first prominent black woman to say, you know what, I want a nice life too. What made you want to write this book, by the way? You've written 4 books about Madam Walker. This is your first about A'Lelia. What gave you the idea? Other than that, you're her namesake.
Yeah, well, that I'm there. So I was first attracted to her. When I was in high school, I wrote a report about A'Lelia Walker and the Harlem Renaissance. Madam Walker was too complicated at that point for me. This is 1970. You know, she was a businesswoman. People thought she'd invented the hot comb. I was so not interested in that, and she did not invent the hot comb, but that was like the thing about her. But A'Lelia Walker had known these writers that I was just starting to discover. And as I was writing on her own ground, I thought I was writing a double biography, and I realized at one point A'Lelia Walker needs her own biography, especially because she has been caricatured. Most of the Harlem Renaissance biographies and histories just kind of say, oh, she had parties, and that's all she did. There's sort of nothing else to her. But I knew I had all of these letters and all of this research. I had met some of her friends, so I knew there was more depth to her, and I wanted to be able to tell that part of her story.
Say more about that. What is the power of gathering? And I mean, I know you all know the power of gathering because you made the decision to come here. Like, you could have been home in your jammies. You made the decision to come here to be with people, right? And some of you all brought friends. So you understand that being with people has meaning, right? Say more about why she, or how she came to understand the power of gathering.
Well, so much of it came from her mother. So in some ways, I was talking to a book club the other day, and someone said, you know, I'm kind of disappointed in her because her mother worked so hard, and, you know, why didn't she do, and look, because her mother wanted her to have a life that hadn't been as hard as her life. She did want her to work hard. She did want her to pay attention. But that was not the dream. Her dream was to do something, to find her own way. That's a normal thing for a kid, and she was a kid, you know, we all are children at some point. And part of what she and her mother both loved was convening people. Madam Walker loved to have dances and parties. You know, once she had some means, there was always live entertainment because they loved music. They had met a lot of musicians even early in their lives. And she was in some ways following in her mother's footsteps. When Madam Walker had the opening party for Villa Lawaro, A'Lelia helped plan that party, but it was kind of a who's who of Black civil rights and, white abolitionists who were there with music by J. Rosamond Johnson, James Weldon Johnson's brother, who was a composer. They wanted to convene people, and that was kind of her, it was like, yes, I've made all this money, but I want to use this money to help bring people together, to be a political activist, but also to be a patron of the arts. And A'Lelia continued that, and she could see the power of that.
Who were some of the people who came through Villa Lawaro? In fact, she had, I remember there was one party you wrote about that was there was like the first Black appointee to some position,
Right.
and she basically kind of presented him. And he was in a very difficult position, right? Because he worked for Woodrow Wilson,
Right.
who was a racist. I mean,
Right,
like, he was
well,
racist.
one of the most racist
Sorry.
presidents in the history of America.
But we're not going to argue about that.
Right. No,
Racist.
even the people
So-
at the Woodrow Wilson House say that.
So the fact is that this is a tricky thing. So
Right.
here's an African-American man. I mean, remember, Woodrow Wilson showed Birth of a Nation at the White House, and one of the most racist films ever.
Right.
And there's a lot of competition for it.
Right.
But
the original
the original, and which glorified the Ku Klux Klan, that acted like, Black men were either idiots or rapacious
Right.
sex fiends. And so here's an African-American man with a position in that administration. You can imagine the position that he was in. So she has a party for him
Right.
at Villa Lawaro, and what was it about?
So the opening party for Villa Lawaro, Madam Walker Madam Walker, actually, so the World War I is going on, and she and other women want to be included in the conversation. And Emmett Scott, who had been Booker T. Washington's, they said secretary, but essentially chief of staff, was, he's in this difficult position where Woodrow Wilson's Secretary of War, Newton Baker, is saying, we don't really want to talk about this race thing because it's, it could compromise what we're doing. But there were newspaper editors and other activists who are like, we need to talk about this race thing during the war. But Madam Walker, in order to insert herself into the conversation, because she and other women were not being included in something that was called a Committee of 100, that were to sort of talk about the war in the Black community. So she invites him to be her, keynote guest, her honored guest. But A'Lelia is helping to plan the party. So that, there's a little bit of tension that happens because at some point Madam Walker must have said to her when she's doing the invitations that I want this to be a conference of interest to the race. And when Emmett Scott's people saw that, he was like crazed because he was nervous that this might make President Wilson unhappy. The party happened, but A'Lelia Walker had really been involved in setting it up. And then that was August of 1918. Madam Walker dies in 1919, but Emmett Scott has become friendly with A'Lelia Walker, and he asked her if she will host C.D.B. King, the president of Liberia, in 1921, because he's in Washington trying to get some money from after the war, but he's not invited to the White House, but he is invited to Villa Lawaro.
Who were some of the people who came through Villa Lawaro? Just to give us the best book.
W.E.B. Du Bois, Paul Robeson, Langston Hughes, Jessie Fawcett, I'm thinking like, who else? And at her parties, both at Villa Lawaro and at the townhouse on 136th Street, anybody who's part of the Harlem Renaissance was there. The Dark Tower itself, Langston Hughes's poem was on one wall, Countee Cullen's poem is on the other wall. So,
say the significance of that. Why the fact that having Langston Hughes on one wall and Countee Cullen on the other wall was such a powerful thing to do?
Because we think, okay, Zora Neale Hurston, Langston Hughes, Countee Cullen, those are sort of Harlem Renaissance people. Those are names we know. But their aesthetic was quite different. Langston Hughes's poem, The Weary Blues, was on the wall. Well, that's because Langston was much more interested in the blues aesthetic, the blues rhythms.
Natural speech, the way folks actually talked.
And real life people. Well, there were people like W.E.B. Du Bois who wanted everybody to sort of be, you know, as snooty as he was, even though he was my intellectual hero for a long time, but he was, you know, very buttoned
He
up.
wanted people to put their best foot forward.
Right,
He
the
felt
representatives of the race representatives. But Countay liked sonnets. I mean, and they were beautiful sonnets, but they were very different. And they were kind of frenemies. I mean, that was, so to have one poem on one wall and one on the other, it just kind of blended them together in the same room.
Would there have been a Harlem Renaissance as we understand it without A'Lelia Walker?
It would have been different. It would have been different. There would have been the same flowering of writing and the art that was there. Elaine Locke, who was the professor at Howard, who was kind of considered a midwife, and Jessie Fawcett, who hasn't gotten enough attention, who was the literary editor of The Crisis. Those kinds of things would have happened, but she gave sort of the vibrancy to it. Her parties gave the vibrancy. So somebody like Nella Larson would have a book party. She'd have a book signing. Well, the book signings could be, you know, quite sedate, and people come and they sip tea or whatever they may do. But for her book party at A'Lelia Walker's Dark Tower, James Weldon Johnson was there, and there was a musician playing music. There were people who were dancing. So she elevated things to a level of joy, which is why Langston Hughes called her the Joy Goddess.
You talked about in your presentation about how her mom was a genius at marketing.
Mm-hmm.
What was Alelia's gift? Because I know she said, at one point in one of her letters that you wrote about, she said, well, you know, I can't write, I'm not a writer, I'm not a singer, I can't write plays, I'm not
my mother.
And I'm not my mother.
And that's I'm not my mother.
But what was she gifted at? What was her gift?
She was a convener. Mm. She was a convener. And you all know the friend who says, come over, we're having the party, and you just don't turn down the invitation.
Well, but you know, sadly, apparently, that is going away. You know, we've heard the Surgeon General say for years that loneliness is like an epidemic in our society, so, which clearly wasn't the case then. People didn't have video games and, you know, and whatever. Right. She had one of the first expensive radios, as I recall, which I thought was so amazing. But tell, like, what was her gift? Was it assembling an interesting group of people that made you want to come? Was it getting people to come out? What was it?
Well, you know, one thing I think to remember is that there were very few people who had three homes. She had the mansion, she had the townhouse in Harlem, and then she had a pied-à-terre. She had a little small apartment that was over near St. Nicholas Park because the townhouse neighborhood had gotten a little bit too busy. But she would call people. She had a group of people, sort of an inner circle of friends. They all had friends, and when Langston Hughes describes one of her parties in his memoir, The Big C, and he essentially says, well, if somebody knew you were going to A'Lelia Walker's, they would bring, it's not just a +1, but a +2, 3, 4, and 5. I mean, your entourage. Because if you went, you might run into Paul Robeson. You might run into Zora Neale Hurston. So if somebody was coming from out of town, that was the first place that their host took them. It's because when I was doing my research, and so I really started doing this research in the 1970s and 80s, so some of these people were still alive, and they would say, there was no other place like it. There was no other place where you might just run into somebody famous, but then they were just sitting there next to you. It wasn't, it was informal in that way.
And it wasn't just African Americans who found their way there, sometimes for good and sometimes not. So
before we get to Van Vechten, you know, she had traveled internationally, and that made a huge difference. So when A'Lelia Walker, and this is really, when you read the book, you'll find out about the two husbands, Wiley Wilson.
We're going to get to those. We're definitely going to get to those.
But
I got it marked.
Right, but yeah, because we have to talk about them. But when she went to Paris in 1921, she had, you know, there were her Black American friends who were living there. One very famous musician, Louis Mitchell, and she spent a month with Louis and his wife. He was playing at one of the most popular clubs in Paris. But she was just kind of blown away by how well her friends were treated. Because on the ship over, she was in first class, and she was meeting lots of Europeans who were very welcoming to her, but there was a Vanderbilt on the ship who talked to a reporter and who was very negative, denigrating about her. So she got that last taste of American racism. But then while she was in Europe, she was just so pleased to be able to move freely. So her circle of friends became international. And when she was designing the Dark Tower, she met with an interior designer named Paul Frankel, who was very famous at the Austrian, who was very famous at the time for building furniture that mimicked skyscrapers, because we were in the beginning of the skyscraper era. And I have this, essentially in his memoir, he wrote about this conversation about her coming into his showroom, and then his assistant sort of put her and her assistant behind a screen because they were afraid that some of his white customers would be nervous, but he was much more cosmopolitan. And he said, she told him, I want this to be an international place. I want this to be a place where people can gather. And so it was her European friends, her African friends, her American friends, her queer friends, her straight friends. Everybody was equally welcome.
But if you just sort of put it into context for us, like I remember reading a statistic once that the year that I was born, in 1959, like 65% of African Americans lived below the statistical poverty line, right? 59. So what does that say about when she was traveling internationally, was spending months abroad like any other wealthy person, but few like her, and had 3 homes, and had the means to be a philanthropist, to convene, and so forth. If you could just sort of put it into some sort of context, like how big of a company was it? So just give us just some sort of data point that we can kind of locate her.
Yeah, so I mean, at that point, it's a little past that initial migration. So 90% of African Americans were living in the South before World War I, and many were sharecroppers and certainly domestic workers. Very few people had any means, but there still was there was a middle class. There were professionals, there were people who owned farms, there were people who owned property, but that was a very small group of people. What Madam Walker had done with her company was to create an avenue for economic independence for women, but it still was a very, very small percentage. So A'Lelia Walker was living this huge, extravagant life and criticized for it. You know, when Madam Walker built her mansion, some people criticized her, and she said, I'm doing this to inspire people, to let them know what is possible for a person who was essentially born to enslaved parents. And A'Lelia Walker, for all the people who criticized her and who projected onto her what they thought she should be doing, there were other people who were like, I wish I could live that life.
Is there any, we can actually take questions. Apparently, are people like sending their questions up? Like we're gonna try to incorporate if you have sort of thoughts and ideas. I mean, we're doing this kind of press club style where, if you all remember what that means. So we're sending cards up so we can kind of sort of keep it going. So we're gonna take your questions and thoughts in just a minute. It was, the thing I appreciate about the book though, it's very warts and all. It's
Yes,
warts and all.
yeah, I was.
So Girlfriend did not have the easiest life. She had a lot of lovely things. She had a lot of fun and a lot of experiences. But this is what you wrote about. It was a sculptor who was, for whom she sat, and she confided in
his wife.
In his wife. And in a letter that he wrote to, one of his weekly letters to his mother, he wrote about her, she is wretched because all the men she loves leave her for other women, and she still loves her last husband from whom she is separated, Max wrote in one of his weekly letters. His rambling recap of Alelia's woes captured the pent-up desperation that tumbled forth. She has to live on a diet which she hates, and she hates her business and its responsibilities, and she regrets the fact that she can't run it as well as her mother did. And because she's so prominent in her race and is so conspicuous, she has to be careful how she behaves. Since she's considered an example, she has to bother with charities which bore her to death, and she hates her house on the Hudson, and she can't sell it because her mothers will forbade it, and in short, her life is almost miserable, and there you are. Come on now. Oh my God. Like, oh my God.
I would listen, when I found that letter, this is a guy, Max Ewing, who was a composer, and she's sitting, he's friends with the sculptor and his wife. That letter, you know, and when your editor is saying, you know, you don't want to just quote, I'm like, this letter is too delicious. I have to use all of it because it is at a moment. By this point, she's had a stroke. She's fully recovered. You know, she's trying to like carve out her own things, self-care. And I think she's probably had a few glasses of champagne at this point.
Well,
And so
as
all
one
of
does.
this, all of that pent up stuff, and she could talk to, in a way that, she could talk to her girlfriends, but in a way that she couldn't sort of unload with other Black people who had these expectations
But let's
of
get
her.
to the tea. Was she so unlucky in love as he described?
Oh, there's the tea. That is the tea.
I mean,
Yeah.
why was
So-
that? Did she just choose poorly?
Yes,
Or what happened here?
Yes, so she wasn't lucky in love. So the first husband, and her mother was really right. Her mother was trying to give her advice that she ignored. First husband was over in a short period of time, but Alelia Walker had 2 boyfriends. This is why the Netflix thing really makes me nuts, because that part is so not true.
None of us saw it.
Right, yeah, okay.
None
Some
of
of you
us,
liked it. Some
Okay.
of you were entertained by it. And Octavia was great. I always want to say that. Blair Underwood is a very nice man. Lots of people worked really hard. But anyway, this part. But so here's the real story. Alelia Walker had 2 boyfriends. Both were doctors. Both were handsome. One was a good guy, and one was a bad boy. And her mother liked the good guy, of course. It's amazing to me. Sometimes people say, the bad boy, and I'm like, really? Your mama would not, your mother did not like the bad boy. But so she ends up marrying them both over a period of time. But she marries the bad boy first, and he does exactly what her mother has predicted. And then
Takes her money to do his own thing.
yes, to do his own.
I mean, he wasn't doing a bad thing with it. He opened a clinic, but still, it was her money, and then was dogging her on the side.
On the side.
Kind of in front of her face, not really.
Totally.
Like not even really on the side.
No, he was Wiley Wilson.
He was bad.
And then she ends up marrying the good guy. But by now he's moved on in other parts of his life, and he's become the number 2 at the Veterans Hospital in Tuskegee. And he's really ensconced there. He's doing stuff that he wants to do. He had been in World War I as a surgeon in the war. He really wanted to work with veterans who had, what we now call PTSD. So he was really into that at the Veterans Hospital. He wasn't going to move, and so they had this long distance relationship. And by that point, it was like bad timing. If she had married him first, maybe it wouldn't have worked out, but.
And she had her adopted daughter, May,
Right.
whom she adopted in part because, their families were close, but also May had beautiful hair.
Right, May had beautiful.
She had beautiful hair, and it was kind of like, she was like a walking billboard
Right.
for their products. But May, same situation, was torn between 2 men, and then Alelia was pushing her toward
The horrible one.
the horrible one, which...
So she's very complicated, and this is what I love about being able to tell her story. She is so not perfect, but she is so interesting. And I think the hardest part for me to write was the part about my grandmother her first husband, not my grandfather. She was forced to marry him, and he was a horrible person. But he was from a good family. He was a doctor, and his grandfather had been very wealthy in the 1870s.
She forced her to marry him because she thought it would be good for publicity.
Right.
She picked all her bridesmaids, she picked all her clothes, and...
It was just another PR.
It was another PR move, and you think, well, wait a minute, like what, I mean, first of all, respect for putting her in warts and all, for not, because just honest, were you ever tempted to be like, oh man, this makes you look bad, I really don't
No,
Never?
I just really want, so here's a key piece for me. When I first started doing my writing about Madam Walker, I was in graduate school. Phil Garland, who had written for Jet and Ebony, was my advisor when I was at Columbia and trying to figure out my master's paper, and I was giving her cliched topics which is, as students do. And at the end of the conversation, she said, your name is Alelia. Do you have any connection to Madam Walker and Alelia Walker? But I was absolutely, in 1975, not walking around, telling people this, because, really, I was trying to be me. And I said, yeah, that's my family. And I think Phil knew the answer. She'd worked at Jet and Ebony. Her mother had been the editor of the Pittsburgh Courier. And I said, yeah, that's my family. And she said, that's what you're going to write about. So that was a key moment for me to have somebody validate this when very few books by or about Black people were being published. But my mother, when I went back to Indianapolis for Christmas, my mother was in the hospital and she had lung cancer. She was terminal, though at 23 that didn't quite, it didn't quite resonate with me. And I was in her hospital room and I said, Mommy, I'm starting to find out that, Madam Walker's not perfect. And I think she had been divorced, it was divorce or something like, but for me that was like not perfect. And I said, what do I do about that? And she said, tell the truth, baby. Oh. It's all right to tell the truth. And so I always, felt that was like a great gift that I got from my mother. So I wanted to, tell the story in the way that I found it.
That's beautiful. Because I can imagine, things are somewhat different now, but I know when you started in the business, and that wasn't that long ago, but when you started, there was a lot of pressure to sort of only put the best foot forward. There's always been this struggle between Du Bois and, and there was always that best foot forward. There were not that many, as you pointed out, biographies about Black people. Everybody's, the famous people on the calendar, right?
Right.
But to sort of say, this woman was terrible to her daughter, her only child, and basically, she's obviously loved her. She wanted the best for her, but to sort of treat her like a PR object.
Right.
Okay, spoiler alert.
And eventually
Spoiler alert, she got rid of the bad husband, which is why we have you.
Right.
So thanks for that.
That's right.
So, okay.
But I just want to say this. So at some point when I'm doing this, I'd written a blog piece and I mentioned Wiley Wilson and his brother. And I got a call out of the blue from a guy who says, I'm Ed Wilson's son, Wiley's nephew. And we talk, and he tells me stories, blah, blah, blah. And then I said, well, what happened to Joyce, Inez and Wiley's daughter? She must be dead by now. He said, oh, no.
Inez being the woman
Inez
that Wiley left Lelia for, that he was having an affair with, sorry.
Very openly.
Openly.
Anyway, so their daughter, Joyce. And he said, no, Joyce is alive. She's in Reno. And so Joyce and I talked once on the phone, but she was, she would send me these emails with all of these details of the people. Now, Inez and Wiley divorced very quickly because Wiley was a dog. But it was amazing to me that Joyce and I were able to develop a relationship.
That's wild. Well, in fact, there's a question about that. One person wants to know, was there anything that particularly surprised you about researching your ancestors? Sounds like everything.
That was everything. You're right. No, everything, really.
Somebody wants to know, what sort of food did A'Lelia serve at her parties?
So she and Madam Walker were both great cooks. A'Lelia Walker was very famous for her spaghetti. When the young writers met to talk about the Dark Tower, her spaghetti that had Chianti in it, it had wine in it that was there. But I have some recipes like Brunswick stew, lemon ice cream. She really loved good food, and she was a good cook.
That's so funny. Okay, I don't envision her cooking herself.
She cooked. She really. There's somebody else said after she died, people were writing about her, and they said, oh no, she really enjoyed cooking for her friends.
Okay.
Like Donna Brazil, maybe. Donna loves. You're a good cook. I'm not a great cook.
I am.
Yeah.
Sorry.
But I'm not.
We'll have to fix that.
I fantasize about being a...
That's funny, because I was cooking for my grandsons before I came over here today, and that's why I was like, hurry up, I gotta go someplace. Okay. What were A'Lelia's politics? Was she politically active like her mother?
Not in exactly the same way, though she was quite aware. And one of my best sources was a woman named Jerry Major, who had been the society columnist for Jet. But during the 20s, she was a society columnist for a bunch of Black newspapers and had her own paper. And when I was interviewing her in the early 80s, I asked about politics. She said, no, she wasn't overly involved, but she definitely knew what was happening. And some of her best friends were very involved in politics. So A. Philip Randolph's wife, Lucille Green, was a Walker-trained beautician. She had run for the Socialist Party in the early 20s. Romery Bearden's mother, Bessie Bearden, was another society columnist. They're part of their inner circle of friends, and she was the chair of the Democratic Women's Club. So her, she definitely knew what was going on.
I do want to go back to the question I asked about some of the white characters who kind of passed through her world. And there was some criticism of this, not because these people were white, but because some of them, because remember, there are a number of these famous figures from the Harlem Renaissance had white patrons who supported their work with various degrees of strings attached or not. I know this is one of the things that was a pain point for Zora Neale Hurston, is like she had to like turn in receipts.
Godmother.
And you know, the godmother retained the rights to her work, whereas with the men she just gave them. Anyway, so there was a pain point to that. But would you just talk a little bit about who some of these characters were? Like, I'm thinking about Carl Van Vechten, right?
Yeah, so
Was he a good? I'm not sure how to feel about him.
Yeah, well, he's complicated.
Yeah.
He's complicated. He should be complicated. You know, there were some people who some white friends who were real friends, and she could hang out with. She enjoyed being around. Van Vechten was complicated because he was really kind of an interloper. On the one hand, he celebrated and supported and pushed Black writers, Black musicians. He later created the James Weldon Johnson collection at Yale's Beinecke Library. It's the biggest collection of Harlem Renaissance material that he personally collected because he and James Weldon Johnson were good friends. But he wrote this book, Nigger Heaven. And it really, that's right, it offended a lot of people. And he had, you know, he was a novelist. He had sort of begun to insert himself and started hanging out in Harlem.
He was like a clout chaser.
Right. And
some people thought he was like a clout chaser. He was only interested in like the most famous people, and people felt like he kind of was a vampire in a way.
Right. That's a good way
Black culture, and then turning it to his purpose in a way like Porgy and Bess. Some people feel. Some people feel.
Right.
You know.
Well, and Amelia Walker resisted him because there had been other journalists who'd really, sort of written about her and perverted the story. But they actually became friends. I mean, that's why it's complicated, because I think he was one of the few people who wasn't asking her to pick up the tab. So he would come to her house, she went to his apartment, and they would hang out together. But they also had a very complicated.
That really does matter, because this is a time when, a lot of Black people did not socialize on an equal footing.
Right.
Even in the allegedly progressive
and
circles.
And he was friends with Gershwin, for instance. He was friends with the Knopfs. He was a lot of publishing people. Yeah. But there were also, he would intentionally, I think, have these parties where Ethel Waters would be at the party, or Elaine Locke. But there was, in his day books, because he kept his detailed day books, there were some of his white friends who he said, well, I can't invite her because her husband doesn't want her to be in the same room with somebody Black. So there was that level of racism that was going on.
What do you think was her best year, or moment, or experience?
Well, I think when she opened Dark Tower, I think October 1927, when she was just the center of attention, but she was also giving people a place where they could gather, and people were excited. She was getting praise for lifting up the young writers and musicians. And then, the flip side of it is that the second anniversary of the Dark Tower was October 1929. And the party was Sunday, and Black Thursday had happened a few days earlier, but people they didn't really fully understand that. And then 2 days later was Black Tuesday, and the market crashed. So it looked like she was going to be able to have this amazing place that was going to be a center for culture, but that just really killed things. And Langston Hughes said that when Amelia Walker died, that was the end of the gay times, the end of the Harlem Renaissance. I don't buy that fully, but it's very dramatic.
Well, you've got a really poignant paragraph here that says, if the market hadn't crashed, if she hadn't spent so much on the furnishings, if she had been, more sort of modest or conservative in her approach to spending, if they hadn't just built this magnificent new factory, maybe.
Right.
What was that like for you when you understood, like, the story of how things Fell apart isn't
apart.
quite right, but,
Right, but-
fell apart really.
Right, but
she
things
had
get-
to sell Villa Lawaro. She had to sell it for not quite pennies on the dollar, but nowhere near what she had paid for it.
Right.
What?
Yeah, I mean, it's heartbreaking, because on the one hand, you want to leave people with this, inspiration and there's triumph, but it is a complicated story. I mean, and at the same time, what she created with her parties, with her gatherings, I think she was a social impresario. There's a sort of a mystique about what she represented in the same way that there's still a mystique about Madam Walker, that she provided jobs for women. She built this house that her attorney thought was extravagant and a white elephant in a way. But Villa Lawaro is still a magical place. The building where the Dark Tower was no longer stands, but Villa Lawaro is now owned by Richelieu Dennis, who was the founder of Sundial Brands and who now owns Essence and does investments in venture capital. But the house is it's a private residence and not zoned for big public events. But in October, he hosted an event, Essence Women in Business, with Ursula Burns, who was the CEO of Xerox, Patti LaBelle, Miss Patti. It was women entrepreneurs, I guess, because Patti has pies. She's an entrepreneur, and in general, and 4 other women. And it was a luncheon, maybe 50 or 60 people, but it was just magical. And people were so excited. Miss Patti was
Sorry,
good.
my invitation must have gotten lost. So
Yeah, well,
I'm
listen, I kind of got there at the I wasn't sure what I was going to, but yes, next year.
Next year.
But they went on and on about what it was like to be in Madam Walker's house.
There was a question about how much archival work had been done before you started your own research. I just want to point out for those of you who are thinking about buying the book or who have already got the book, we're journalists, so we always read the way to the end, okay? We always read right to the end. We stay for the credits. We do that.
Right.
But one of the things I think is really remarkable is that you have a list in the back of all of the sourcing. Why did you feel it was important to include that?
Well, and for people who just want to read the story, I hope it is a well-written story that moves quickly. But I feel as if I'm leaving breadcrumbs. And I did the same thing with On Her Own Ground because I wanted other people 50 years from now or 100 years from now to know the sources if they want to write their own thing. And with A'Lelia Walker in particular, I knew that most of what people knew about her was just like wrong. And so I wanted to have the documentation to tell the story. And I really am fortunate in this way that my grandparents saved everything, the menu and the invitation. I have things that A'Lelia Walker bought in Egypt and some of her clothes and lots, you saw the photographs. But we also, because Madam Walker was a genius about her executive team, 40,000 documents that have been digitized. Now that is just unheard of. But the secretary and the attorney saved these things, so we have their letters, the business records, the tax records, and all of those things. They're at the Indiana Historical Society. And then some of the things from my personal Madam Walker family archives are here. Though I think most of them are in the warehouse, but there are a few things on display.
But I just think there's something really profound about that, because how many of us have gone through our parents' letters and
thrown them out.
So it's a cautionary tale
this is
that
my
your parents' letters, your grandparents' letters, they're special things. And I realize that everybody's a minimalist now and people don't have a lot of space and stuff, but what a treasure to have these things.
I'm like a crazy person about this. So I'm the last man standing in my family, so I'm the one who cleans out all the houses. And it is very tempting to just put it in the dumpster, but I go through everything because you just don't know that photograph. And we are complaining about other people erasing our history, and we are here in the temple of history. And if we don't go through and save those things, grandma's things, we are erasing our history.
Well
so
said.
We must.
I have one last question, and then I want to give you the closing thought. Is there anybody else today that you can think of who does what A'Lelia Walker did? Is there a joy goddess today?
You know what? There are a lot of joy goddesses. And we know some of them, and all of you know some of them. We know friends who have wonderful homes with great art collections, who have space where they can have people perform music. And that, I think there are a lot of those folks. And I won't name names because I will leave out somebody, but I have, more than a few friends who do this because they have the means. I mean, then it was really unusual for somebody to have a home like that. Again, her friends on Drivers Row had beautiful homes, but she was the one who had the magnetism and the charisma to bring people together.
And the relationships.
And the relationships.
To bring people.
But we know lots of people with great art collections and beautiful homes.
But I really would like to ask a challenge to some of our young folks who perhaps don't think they have beautiful homes and art collections yet. I would really like to ask some of you to think about that. The fact that you don't have to have 3 homes. You don't have to have fabulous art. What you have to have is a desire to bring people together. I really like to ask some of you all to think about that. Are you thinking about your relationships with other people? Are you getting together? Or are you spending all your time doing this? Doing this? Doing this? I'm just saying, everybody can be a joy goddess.
Absolutely.
I'm sorry. That's all I'm going to say. I'm going to get off my soapbox.
But I'm doing some closing remarks. But today, this afternoon, I had a Zoom call with a sister who lives in Durham, and she reached out to me because she's doing a salon with people, with artists, because she grew up in North Carolina, lived in New York, lived in LA, is back in North Carolina, and she said, I'm really determined to make sure that we create a cultural scene here. And she wanted to use the image of the Dark Tower bookcase, and she was asking my permission. So we had this conversation, and she doesn't have she's using somebody else's space. But there are any number of people. It's just, you have a room in your house and you bring people together who create. And there are lots of people doing that. It doesn't, as you say, it doesn't have to be the big spacious house. It is, who do you know who can read poetry, who can, play the drums, who can play the violin, just whatever to bring people together.
Or read a poem. Get you some Pepperidge Farm cookies.
Right, that's all you need.
And some tea or whatever, y'all. Whatever.
Because maybe
Whatever.
that my, sort of closing thought is,
yeah, just give us a closing thought. I know that folks are going to want to meet you later and sign books. So just what is a thought that you'd like to leave us with?
Well, because we are in a moment where it's really tough, and I think about the last 50 or so years when, when my high school history book said Negroes were contented as slaves, not enslaved people. Because they were better off than free people because they were clothed and fed. So that was what my high school history textbook said. My grandfather told a different story, but I learned this history. I taught myself this history, and this place that we're in now is a place that I didn't have when I was growing up. And so I just want us to think about what we do every day to preserve our history, what we do in terms of telling our family stories. No matter what happens, if someone says they're going to not be able to not tell the story, they're not going to fund it, whatever happens, we carry it within ourselves every day. And it's our responsibility to teach the young people in our communities and in our families. And it's very easy now. You have a phone, your children have phones, your grandchildren have phones. For every time the young people in your life are on FaceTime or they're with an elder in the family, to take out that phone and have them ask 2 or 3 questions. And by the end of the year, you will have an hour's worth of answers to those questions. And that is the way that you'd start to tell your family history.
Lilia Bundles, thank you so much.
Thank you, Michelle.
Okay, all right. I'm going to leave you to your book signing. Thank you. Thank you all for coming.
So come buy books.
Yes.
And follow me on Instagram at Alilia Bundles. leave a comment. Thank you, Leslie.
Thanks. I just want to hear what you say.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us this evening, and happy Black History Month.
Okay.
We hope that you return to the museum for our new exhibitions, as well as all of our wonderful Black
Want the
History Month
microphone
programming.
back.
And join us
All right.
upstairs where Miss Bundles will be
Like
having
that.
a book sale as well as a signing. So thank you so much and have a great evening. Good night.